Well, it's no secret the coronavirus pandemic has taken a heavy toll on the global economy in the past year. A new report by the International Labour Organization gives a clearer indication of the extent of its impact on workers. Hundreds of millions of people have lost their jobs, and most of them live in the poorest parts of the world. Paolo Montecillo has more.
A steady income has never been a certainty for casual laborers like Vikram Das. With India battling possibly the world's worst outbreak of COVID-19, opportunities to earn have all but dried up.
I haven't worked a single day in the past month. Now the situation is that we don't have food to eat. We have family, children at home. If we don't work, how are we going to survive?
He's one of millions of people around the world struggling to put food on the table as a result of the pandemic. In a new report, the International Labour Organization says more than 140 million employees lost their jobs in 2020 due to the economic fallout from COVID-19. Including reduced working hours, the global economy lost 255 million full-time positions. That translates to $3.7 trillion in lost income, or 4.4% of global GDP. And it's developing nations like those in Africa that have been hit the hardest. Although the WHO estimates African countries account for just 3% of all coronavirus infections and deaths, the Mo Ibrahim Foundation says the continent's economy shrank for the first time in 30 years in 2020. Unemployment is also at a 10-year high of 7.7%, and there's a shortage of inoculations.
It's totally unacceptable that vaccines are not now fully available to the African continent, that Africa is dramatically lagging behind in vaccination because of lack of vaccines available to the African continent.
The UN chief points to the multilateral COVAX initiative, which aims to distribute 2 billion doses to poor countries this year. So far, he says, the project has failed to deliver.
But the COVAX until now only was able to ship 72 million doses. The COVAX has a financial problem that is not solved, so we must fully fund the COVAX. And the COVAX has a supply problem that has not been solved.
Almost 85% of all vaccines have gone to people in high and middle income economies. The poorest nations have received just 0.3% of the total number of shots manufactured. The ILO says this gap means rich countries are on track for a post-pandemic boom, while the rest of the world will have to wait a lot longer to recover. Paolo Montecillo, TRT World.
Well, for more on this, let's go to Stefan Kuehn in Geneva. He's an economist at the International Labour Organization and was the lead author of the group's World Employment and Social Outlook report. Welcome to the program, Stefan. Now, one of the things that really jumped out at me in your report was the finding that the pandemic has wiped out 5 years of progress towards the eradication of working poverty. Can you explain to us what that is exactly and how the coronavirus crisis has wiped out those gains?
The eradication of poverty in all its forms is the first goal of the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. And paid work is an integral part of this process. And despite being in paid work, even before the crisis, we had hundreds of millions of workers who could not escape poverty. And this crisis had made things a lot worse. So an additional 100 million people or workers now live in poverty, in an extreme or moderate poverty, meaning on less than $3.20 US per day. And the reason why this pandemic had such a big impact on working poverty as well is because even though people might not have lost their job entirely, they still couldn't continue with their economic activity as they wanted before. So they had to reduce their working hours, and they were unable to earn as much income from their activity. This all contributed to them falling below the poverty line again.
So,
and as you said, yes.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt there. Can you tell us which types of workers have been particularly hard hit by this pandemic? And do you expect their situation to improve as economies around the world begin to reopen?
The pandemic had a highly heterogeneous impact on workers. For instance, frontline workers in essential activities faced a high health risk, but they kept their job. On the other hand, we have a lot of workers or people who actually lost their job, for instance, in the food and accommodation sectors, but also in manufacturing. And so all those workers that were affected by workplace closures. Nevertheless, the impact on workers depends very much in where they live, because in high-income countries with well-developed social protection systems, even though they couldn't continue their activity, their incomes were supported by the government or by other systems, while the workers that were truly the hardest hit in the world are those that did not benefit from such social protection systems and that lived in and that were affected by working hour losses. So of particular concern are here the informal workers. So the world has in 2019 had 2 billion informal workers, that's 61% of all workers, and those were at particular risk of actually losing their livelihood in this pandemic. And for going forward, what we are seeing is a shift towards self-employment in developing countries, which means that and this it's a type of self-employment that's not born out of having a great business idea, but it's because of the need to do some activity for survival, in the sense. And this means that those workers are unlikely to earn a proper income and then to escape poverty.
Now, we know the rollout of COVID-19 vaccines across the globe has really helped countries to reopen their economies and get people back to work. But we also know that poorer countries haven't been able to spend the billions of dollars to secure these vaccines for their populations. How important is it that richer countries look to help out their poorer neighbours in order to help them get back to business as well?
I think we can say that the pandemic is not over anywhere until it's over everywhere. And it's true. So there are two important aspects. So one is we want to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and the longer the pandemic hits labor market and impedes proper functioning of labor markets, the more likely it is that workers will carry away deep scars from the pandemic, from being out of the labor market, from not properly being able to participate in the labor market, which makes their employability, their income potential in the future lower, and which also will hamper productivity and therefore also the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And the second aspect is that in today's globalized world, the supply chain disruptions and also the loss of aggregate demand will also affect high-income countries when somewhere in other countries that do not have sufficient access to vaccines, the pandemic imposes new restrictions on the economy and on the labor markets.
So overall, though, your report shows that global employment is improving as this pandemic eases in some parts of the world. At least you show the global unemployment rate will decrease this year and will further decrease next year. But as we're all too aware, the economic recovery is anything but even across the globe. We're seeing lockdown measures return in parts of Asia, India in particular, as well as parts of South America. How is that reflected in the findings of your report? Are they being reflected in the figures when it comes to the labour markets in various parts of the world?
Yes, the uneven recovery is reflected, and here we have an uneven recovery on two dimensions actually. So one is the uneven recovery in the sense of having access to vaccines that allow the impact of the pandemic to diminish and eventually to disappear. And the second source of unevenness is having the access to fiscal support, fiscal stimulus to stimulate the economy. And here high-income countries, as you already mentioned, have a clear advantage and will be able to have a much higher employment growth. However, in lower income countries, as I mentioned before, people will take up some activity to earn some kind of living. But so the employment growth, even though it's lower than in high-income countries, it's still there, but it will come at the cost of productivity and of incomes. And this will and that creates an unevenness in the world, not only in terms of employment figures, but also in terms of growth of incomes, and it will widen global inequalities.
Okay, Stefan Kuehn from the International Labour Organization, thank you so much again for joining us on the program.